I have some good news and I have some bad news. The bad news first, 1.20.10 has come along and totally broken one player sleep. Which is not good news because a lot of people rely on that for servers and realms and even the single player worlds with friends. So I've had to fix it. And the fix is a little bit janky, but it's as good as I can get. The good news is, though, that this new pack won't conflict with any other add-ons, which means OPS or One Player Sleep will now work on any world, realm or server without any issues or conflict. So let's check out what the problem is, shall we? So the way One Player Sleep used to work is that there were animation controllers running from the player entity, which meant that any add-on or pack that also used the player entity would conflict with it. And what would happen with this animation controller? It would detect when the player is asleep using some Molang queries. Query is sleeping, it would detect if the player was in bed asleep, and when it was, it would run an animation. And that animation would basically be 1.2 seconds long, and it would tell everybody else that the player is sleeping. It would then, after a second, set the time to the next day and clear the weather, and then it would wake the player up and say good morning. And it all worked perfectly well. The player would go to sleep, it would detect the player was asleep, and it would pass the time to day if they'd been in bed for more than a second. Great! So what went wrong? Well, for some reason in 1.20.10, it does register the player as being asleep, but as soon as the player got into bed, it would cancel any of the animation controllers, meaning the animations wouldn't run. And there was a very easy janky fix, and that was to make it so as soon as you got into bed, it would pass the night instantly rather than waiting a second, which worked sometimes but not always, depending on how quickly the game decided that the player was actually asleep. So I've come up with a whole new way of doing it that is less janky, and like I say, the good news is it doesn't conflict with anything. So now, instead of using the player and the animation controllers to detect when the player is asleep, I've written a beta API piece of code which is not using any of the experimental features, so it will work without experiments on any world, server or realm. And all it's doing is detecting if a player is standing on a bed. If they're standing on the bed, do they get into the bed? And when they get in the bed, after a certain amount of time, it will set the time to the next day and get the player out of bed. Simple. So let's see this in action. Let's stand on the bed, click the bed, and then after a couple of seconds, it's going to get me out of bed and say good morning. There you go. It worked perfectly. The problem though, because it's a little bit janky, if you're not standing on a bed and you get into bed, it's not going to work. It's just going to do the vanilla way of sleeping, which means that if, you're on a server with more than one person and you want to pass the night, you need to stand on the bed in order to do it, which kind of sucks, but it's the only way I can do it right now. And of course, you can get the new version of this pack from FoxyNoTail.com. And while you're clicking around down there, why don't you hit that like button and potentially subscribe if you're not already for future updates and add-ons. And even though this isn't using any experiments from the beta API system, no doubt at some point in the future this will break, but hopefully some point in the future the player sleeping system will be fixed by Mojang, that bug will be squashed, and we'll be able to go back to the good way of doing it. Let's see, shall we? Thanks very much for watching. I'll see you all in the next one. Goodbye.